Picture this, a civilization that navigated thousands of miles of open ocean without compasses or maps, using only stars, waves, and seabirds to find tiny islands in the world's largest ocean. Around 3,500 years ago, in the warm waters between New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, a remarkable people emerged who would eventually become the ancestors of the Māori. These were the Lapita people, master mariners whose distinctive pottery decorated with intricate geometric patterns has been discovered across dozens of archaeological sites from the Bismarck archipelago to Samoa. What drove them to leave their homes and venture into the unknown Pacific? The answer lies in a combination of population pressure, environmental changes, and that timeless human urge to discover what lies beyond the horizon. The Lapita weren't just wanderers, they were technological innovators who revolutionized Pacific maritime technology. Their settlements, strategically located on beaches with direct deep water access, reveal evidence of sophisticated canoe construction techniques that would enable voyages across thousands of miles of treacherous ocean. They developed the distinctive Polynesian double-hulled vessel design, with two parallel hulls connected by a platform sturdy enough to carry entire families, livestock, pigs, dogs, chickens, and essential supplies for establishing new communities on distant shores. These magnificent craft measured up to 30 meters in length, carved from massive tree trunks and fitted with sewn plank extensions that created exceptional seaworthiness and cargo capacity far superior to anything Europeans would develop for centuries. Think about what this meant. These ancient mariners possessed the confidence and skill to load their families onto wooden vessels and sail into the unknown, knowing they might never find land, might never return home, might perish in storms or from thirst. Yet they did it anyway, generation after generation, driven by dreams of new territories and better lives. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tiuma in Vanuatu reveals that Lapita communities maintained extensive trade networks spanning over 4,000 kilometers, with obsidian tools manufactured in the Admiralty Islands discovered in settlements throughout the region. This wasn't random island hopping, this was systematic exploration and colonization backed by sophisticated navigation knowledge that would be passed down through generations and eventually lead their descendants to discover the last major landmass on Earth. The navigational techniques developed by Polynesian wayfinders represented one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements, rivaling any European navigation system until the modern era. These master navigators, known as palu in some traditions, developed an intricate system that combined astronomical observation, ocean current analysis, and wildlife behavior patterns into a comprehensive mental map of the Pacific. They memorized the rising and setting positions of over 200 stars, creating celestial maps that remained accurate across thousands of miles of ocean travel. But that was just the beginning. They also learned to read the subtle variations in wave patterns caused by distant islands, understanding how swells refracted around land masses even when those islands remained far below the horizon. The training required to become a master navigator began in childhood and lasted decades, involving intensive memorization and practical experience that created mental databases of oceanic knowledge. Aspiring navigators learn to recognize the phosphorescence patterns created by different types of marine life, the seasonal variations in ocean currents, and the significance of wind shifts that indicated approaching weather systems. They understood that certain seabirds only flew within specific distances from land, using the flight paths of frigate birds, terns, and boobies as living compasses pointing toward unseen islands. Cloud formations provided additional clues. Distinctive clouds that developed over different types of terrain could be detected from over 50 miles away, revealing the presence of high volcanic islands versus low coral atolls. Here's what's truly remarkable. The most skilled navigators could determine their position within a few miles after weeks at sea, an accuracy that rivaled European navigational instruments well into the 18th century. On the Marshall Islands, traditional stick charts made from coconut ribs and cowrie shells preserved knowledge of wave patterns and island positions, creating three-dimensional maps that encoded centuries of voyaging experience. And these weren't primitive tools, they were sophisticated instruments that represented fundamentally different ways of understanding and navigating the ocean, ways that proved equally effective to European methods while requiring no manufactured equipment whatsoever. This accumulated knowledge would eventually enable the greatest voyage of all, the discovery of New Zealand, the final frontier of human expansion. The colonization of central Polynesia proceeded systematically over several centuries, with each generation of voyagers pushing further east into unexplored waters. Fiji, Tonga and Samoa were settled by 2800 years ago, with archaeological evidence from sites like Mulifanua in Samoa revealing typical lapita assemblages including distinctive pottery, shell ornaments, and evidence of introduced Pacific crops like taro, yams, and breadfruit. These island groups became crucial staging areas for further expansion, developing into population centers with thousands of inhabitants who would launch subsequent voyages deeper into the Pacific. Something fascinating happened during this period. The lapita culture gradually transformed into distinctly Polynesian societies, marked by the abandonment of pottery making in favor of wooden and gourd containers and the development of increasingly sophisticated wood carving and textile traditions. The Society Islands, including Tahiti, were reached approximately 2,000 years ago, followed by the Marquesas around 1800 years ago. These volcanic islands offered extensive fertile valleys and abundant marine resources, supporting larger populations than the smaller atolls of central Polynesia. Archaeological excavations at sites like Hane on Uahuka in the Marquesas have revealed evidence of immediate environmental impact. The extinction of several endemic bird species and rapid deforestation in coastal areas occurred within generations of human arrival. The colonizers brought with them a complete agricultural package including taro, sweet potato, breadfruit, coconut and banana, along with pigs, dogs and chickens that quickly established themselves in the island ecosystems, forever transforming these pristine environments. But here's the critical question: why did they keep going? These eastern Polynesian islands were paradise, fertile land, abundant fish, perfect climate. Yet generation after generation, voyagers continued launching expeditions into the unknown eastern Pacific. Paleoenvironmental studies reveal a consistent pattern: initial population growth followed by resource depletion and ecological degradation. On smaller islands, deforestation occurred within centuries of human arrival, while marine resources faced increasing pressure from growing populations. The introduction of pigs and other domestic animals often led to competition with native species and habitat destruction. These environmental challenges, combined with social tensions arising from population density and resource competition, created powerful incentives for continued exploration. And somewhere out there in the vast ocean, rumors spoke of a great land beneath the long white cloud. From these eastern Polynesian strongholds, voyagers launched the final phase of Pacific colonization that would eventually reach New Zealand. The Cook Islands were settled around 1500 years ago, followed by Easter Island approximately 1200 years ago, in one of the most remarkable feats of prehistoric navigation ever accomplished. Think about that for a moment. Easter Island, located over 2,000 miles from the nearest populated land, was successfully found, colonized and settled by people navigating with stars and waves alone. The successful colonization of such a remote speck in the vast Pacific demonstrates the extraordinary capabilities of Polynesian voyagers and their sophisticated understanding of oceanic geography that modern scholars are only beginning to fully appreciate. Within Maori tradition, these ancient migrations are preserved in accounts of legendary voyages and navigators whose names echo through the centuries. According to traditional narratives recorded by 19th century scholars, Kupe, the great navigator whose name means to turn up the edge, originated from Hawaii, the ancestral homeland that features prominently in Polynesian genealogies throughout the Pacific. While the precise geographical location of Hawaii remains debated among scholars, linguistic and cultural evidence suggests connections to the Society Islands, particularly Raiatea, which was known as Hawaii in ancient times. Kupe embodies the characteristics of the master navigator, possessing both practical seafaring skills and supernatural abilities that enabled him to traverse the vast distances between Polynesia and New Zealand. Traditional accounts describe Kupe's vessel Te Amorangi, a great waka, capable of carrying substantial crews and supplies across thousands of miles of open ocean. The narratives detail his encounters with sea monsters, his use of celestial navigation, and his discovery of the distinctive long white cloud that marked the presence of a previously unknown southern land. These oral traditions preserved in Wakapapa that connect contemporary Māori to their Polynesian ancestors provide crucial insights into the motivations and methods of early Pacific voyages. The genealogies trace descent lines back through dozens of generations to the original inhabitants of Hawaii, maintaining cultural connections across vast temporal and geographical distances that span nearly a millennium. The accumulated navigational knowledge of centuries of Pacific exploration finally converged in a remarkable achievement that would establish human presence in the last major landmass to be colonized on Earth. Archaeological evidence from New Zealand's earliest settlement sites reveals that Polynesian voyagers successfully navigated the treacherous waters of the Southern Ocean sometime between 1200 and 1300 AD, completing humanity's final chapter of prehistoric expansion. The precision required for this achievement cannot be overstated. New Zealand lies approximately 2,000 kilometers southeast of the nearest Polynesian settlements in the Cook Islands, across waters notorious for unpredictable weather patterns, powerful westerly winds, and temperatures significantly colder than anything experienced in tropical Polynesia. The Wairau Bar site on New Zealand's South Island provides the most comprehensive archaeological evidence for these first arrivals. Excavations conducted since the 1940s have revealed a substantial settlement containing over 40 burials, extensive middens filled with the remains of now extinct moa birds, and a rich assemblage of artifacts that demonstrate direct connections to central Polynesian culture. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from the deepest cultural layers consistently produces dates between 1280 and 1300 AD, establishing this period as the most likely time frame for initial human colonization. Here's what's particularly fascinating. The burial practices documented at Wairau Bar mirror those found in contemporary Society Island sites, with individuals interred in extended positions accompanied by personal ornaments, including whale tooth pendants, bonefish hooks, and polished stone adzes. Among the Wairau Bar artifacts are distinctive pearl shell fish hooks manufactured from pink Tridacna maxima shells that occur naturally only in the warm waters of tropical Polynesia, thousands of miles away. These hooks, along with worked pieces of obsidian traced through chemical analysis to sources in Maya Island off New Zealand's North Island, indicate that the earliest settlers maintained sophisticated tool-making traditions while rapidly exploiting local resources. And the presence of tropical shell artifacts in New Zealand's earliest archaeological context provides compelling evidence that the colonizing voyages carried substantial quantities of essential equipment from their Polynesian homeland, suggesting well-planned expeditions rather than accidental discoveries. These weren't lost fishermen blown off course. These were deliberate colonization voyages carrying families, supplies, and the tools needed to establish permanent settlements in a completely new environment. The legendary accounts of the Great Migration, waka preserved in Māori oral tradition, provide complementary evidence for understanding the scale and organization of early colonization efforts. The Tainui Waka, according to traditional narratives recorded by 19th century scholars, carried the ancestors of several major tribal groups including Te Werowero, Maniapoto, and the Waikato Iwi. The detailed genealogies associated with Tainui traced descent lines through specific individuals, including the navigator Aotearoa and the chief Watihwa, whose descendants established settlements throughout the North Island's western regions. These genealogical records, cross-referenced between different tribal traditions, suggest that Tainui represented a substantial colonizing expedition carrying multiple family groups with the demographic diversity necessary for successful long-term settlement. Te Arawa, another prominent waka in migration traditions, reportedly brought the ancestors of the Te Arawa Confederation to the Bay of Plenty region under the leadership of the navigator Tamatekapua. The traditional accounts describe conflicts between different waka crews during the voyage, reflecting the social tensions that likely arose during months-long ocean crossings involving multiple competing leadership groups. Think about the reality of these voyages, dozens of people packed onto wooden vessels for weeks or months, enduring storms, thirst, uncertainty, and fear, while navigators tried to maintain course toward an island they'd only heard about in stories. The Te Arawa traditions include detailed descriptions of landfall procedures, resource allocation protocols, and territorial boundary establishment that suggest sophisticated planning for post-arrival settlement organization. Archaeological evidence from the Bay of Plenty region supports these traditional accounts, and with early occupation sites concentrated around natural harbors and river mouths that would have provided essential fresh water and marine resources for newly arrived colonists. The Mataatua Waka traditions associated with the ancestors of Ngi Tuho and other eastern Bay of Plenty iwi describe a voyage led by the chief Toroa that established settlements along the eastern North Island coast. Traditional accounts of Mataatua include references to specific navigation techniques, including the use of trained birds released at intervals to indicate the direction of land and the observation of distinctive cloud formations that develop over large landmasses. These navigational details, preserved in oral tradition for over 700 years, demonstrate the sophisticated knowledge systems that enabled successful Pacific voyaging. The adaptation challenges faced by these early settlers were unprecedented in the history of Polynesian expansion. New Zealand's temperate climate represented a dramatic departure from the tropical environments that had shaped Polynesian culture for over 3,000 years. Average temperatures in New Zealand during the 13th century were several degrees lower than those experienced in central Polynesia, with winter conditions that included frost and snow in many regions, phenomena completely unknown in the tropical Pacific. The seasonal variations in daylight hours, ranging from less than 9 hours during winter to over 15 hours during summer, required fundamental adjustments to agricultural practices and daily activity patterns that had been standardized across tropical Pacific societies for generations. The flora and fauna encountered by early settlers bore little resemblance to the familiar ecosystems of Polynesia. The absence of coconut palms, breadfruit trees, and other staple food sources forced immediate dietary adaptations and the development of entirely new, subsistence strategies. The native New Zealand flora included numerous fern species whose roots could be processed into edible starch, but the extraction and preparation techniques required extensive experimentation and cultural innovation. Archaeological evidence from early sites shows gradual increases in the quantities of bracken fern root processing stones, indicating that this indigenous food source became increasingly important as traditional Polynesian crops proved unsuitable for New Zealand's cooler conditions. Here's what's truly remarkable about this adaptation. Imagine arriving in a land where none of your traditional food plants will grow, where winter brings frost that would kill tropical crops, where the very rhythm of seasons differs from everything you've ever known. Yet these settlers not only survived, they thrived, developing entirely new agricultural systems within generations. The introduction of traditional Polynesian crops met with mixed success in New Zealand's temperate environment. Taro, a staple throughout Polynesia, could only be grown successfully in the warmer northern regions of the North Island, and even there required careful site selection and cultivation techniques adapted to cooler conditions. Sweet potato, known as kumara in Māori tradition, proved more adaptable but still required the development of specialized storage techniques to preserve tubers through the harsh winter months, innovations that would become central to Māori culture. The fauna of New Zealand presented both unprecedented opportunities and challenges for Polynesian settlers accustomed to the limited terrestrial animals of Pacific islands. The absence of native land mammals meant that the pigs, dogs and chickens brought by the colonizers faced no competition from indigenous species, but it also meant that traditional hunting practices required complete revision. The presence of large flightless moa birds, some species weighing over 200 kilograms, provided an unprecedented protein source that could support larger populations than had been possible on smaller Pacific islands. But here's the thing. These massive birds had evolved in complete isolation from mammalian predators, having no instinctive fear of humans, making them initially easy prey, but also making their extinction nearly inevitable once systematic hunting began. The hunting techniques required to successfully capture moa differed substantially from the fishing and small game hunting practices developed in Polynesia. Archaeological evidence from moa hunting sites reveals the use of sophisticated trapping systems, including pit traps lined with sharpened stakes, drive lanes constructed from stone walls that channeled birds toward killing areas, and specialized tools including long-handled clubs designed for dispatching large, flightless birds. The Pyramid Valley site in Canterbury contains evidence of intensive moa hunting operations, with bone assemblages indicating the systematic processing of hundreds of individual birds using standardized butchering techniques that maximized meat recovery and hide preservation. The development of distinctly Māori cultural practices began immediately upon arrival as Polynesian traditions encountered the unique challenges and opportunities of the New Zealand environment. The construction techniques employed in early settlements show rapid adaptation to local materials and conditions, with traditional Polynesian post and beam architecture modified to incorporate native timber species and respond to different wind and weather patterns. Excavated house sites from the earliest occupation layers reveal experimentation with foundation designs, wall construction methods, and roofing materials as settlers learned to work with unfamiliar building resources. The artistic traditions brought from Polynesia underwent similar adaptation processes as craftspeople learned to work with New Zealand materials, gradually transferring the distinctive geometric patterns found on Polynesian bark cloth and pottery to carved wooden objects made from native timber species. The social organization of early Maori communities reflects both continuity with Polynesian traditions and adaptation to New Zealand conditions. The Wakapapa system of genealogical reckoning remained central to social identity and resource allocation, but the abundance of land and resources in New Zealand allowed for more dispersed settlement patterns than had been possible on smaller Pacific islands. Archaeological evidence suggests that early communities were organized around extended family groups occupying discrete territories defined by natural boundaries such as river valleys or coastal stretches. These territorial arrangements, established during the initial settlement period, would form the foundation for the complex iwi and hapu social structures that characterized later Maori society. The territorial arrangements established during these early centuries underwent profound transformation as Maori communities expanded and developed increasingly sophisticated social structures. The abundance of resources and vast expanses of unoccupied land that had characterized the early settlement period gradually gave way to more complex patterns of territorial control and resource management as populations grew and communities established permanent claims to specific geographical areas. Archaeological evidence from sites across both islands reveals a dramatic shift from the mobile hunting camps of the earliest settlers to substantial permanent settlements featuring elaborate storage facilities, defensive earthworks, and specialized craft production areas that indicate growing social complexity and economic sophistication. The evolution from loosely organized kinship groups to the complex iwi and hapu structures that would define classical Maori society reflected both demographic pressures and the development of sophisticated genealogical knowledge systems. Wakapapa, the intricate web of genealogical connections that traced descent from common ancestors, became the fundamental organizing principle of Maori social organization. Unlike the relatively simple kinship structures that had sufficed for small island populations in Polynesia, the expanding Maori communities required more complex systems to manage relationships between groups that might be separated by hundreds of kilometers while still maintaining ancestral connections to the original migration waka. But storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Changes that would transform Maori society forever were approaching from across the Pacific. The iwi, or tribal confederations, emerged as the largest stable social units, typically comprising several thousand individuals who could trace descent from a common ancestor through carefully maintained genealogical records. Aotearoa, for example, traces its origins to Rangitihi, the Tuhunga, or spiritual leader of the Arawa Waka, whose descendants established settlements around Lake Taupo and the central North Island volcanic plateau. Archaeological investigations around the lake have revealed a network of settlements dating from the 14th century onwards, with evidence of specialized fishing installations, obsidian quarrying operations, and elaborate burial grounds that reflect the growing social stratification within the developing tribal structure. These weren't simple villages, these were complex societies with specialized economic activities, hierarchical social structures, and sophisticated resource management systems. Within each iwi, the hapu functioned as the primary economic and social units, typically consisting of between 100 and 500 individuals who shared common descent from a more recent ancestor, usually within 5 to 7 generations. The hapu controlled specific territories that provided access to diverse resource zones, including coastal fishing grounds, inland hunting areas, agricultural land, and sources of raw materials for tool production. Ngati Porou iwi of the east coast, descended from the Horuta Waka, developed a complex hapu system that allocated different coastal and inland territories to related family groups, with each hapu maintaining exclusive rights to particular fishing reefs, bird snaring areas, and seasonal resource gathering sites. The concept of wakapapa extended far beyond simple genealogical record-keeping to encompass a comprehensive worldview that defined relationships between people, land, and spiritual forces. Wakapapa connected living individuals not only to their human ancestors, but also to the natural features of their territories, creating spiritual bonds between communities and specific mountains, rivers, forests, and coastal areas. Tainui Iwi's connection to the Waikato River exemplifies this relationship, with traditional accounts describing how the river was formed by the passage of their ancestral waka inland from the coast, creating a permanent spiritual link between the people and the waterway that sustained their communities. Think about what this means. The land wasn't just property to be owned and exploited. It was family, it was ancestors, it was identity itself. This genealogical framework provided the foundation for the complex concepts of tapu and mana that governed all aspects of Maori social interaction. Tapu, often translated as sacredness or spiritual restriction, represented a sophisticated system of behavioral protocols that regulated access to resources, social interactions, and ritual activities. Different categories of tapu applied to chiefs, commoners, warriors, and Tuhunga, with elaborate rules governing when and how individuals of different status could interact. Archaeological evidence from burial sites reveals the material expression of these status distinctions, with high-ranking individuals interred with elaborate grave goods including greenstone ornaments, whale-tooth pendants, and finely carved wooden artifacts, while commoners received simpler burial treatments with fewer accompanying objects. Mana, the spiritual power that individuals could accumulate through successful leadership, military prowess, or spiritual knowledge, provided the dynamic element within the social hierarchy. Unlike inherited status based purely on genealogical position, mana could be gained or lost through individual actions, creating opportunities for ambitious individuals to enhance their social standing, while also providing mechanisms for the community to withdraw support from ineffective leaders. The archaeological record from fortified settlements shows evidence of this dynamic social system, with some sites displaying rapid expansion and elaborate construction projects that suggest successful leadership, while others show signs of abandonment or destruction that may reflect the loss of mana by their inhabitants. The economic foundation of classical Maori society rested on sophisticated systems of resource management that maximized the productivity of New Zealand's diverse ecosystems while maintaining sustainable harvesting practices. The development of intensive horticulture represented perhaps the most significant economic innovation of this period, as communities learned to cultivate traditional Polynesian crops in New Zealand's challenging temperate environment. Kumara cultivation became particularly important, with archaeological evidence from the Auckland region revealing extensive field systems featuring raised beds, drainage channels, and storage pit complexes that could preserve sweet potato tubers through the winter months. Innovations that enabled much larger populations than hunting and gathering alone could support. The Maori agricultural system incorporated detailed knowledge of seasonal patterns, soil types, and microclimatic variations that enabled successful cultivation in marginal environments. The construction of stone-walled gardens in exposed coastal areas provided protection from salt spray and wind, while inland communities developed sophisticated techniques for selecting and preparing planting sites on north-facing slopes that maximized exposure to winter sunlight. Excavations at Palliser Bay on the southern tip of the North Island have revealed an extensive agricultural landscape featuring hundreds of storage pits, field boundaries, and residential sites that supported a substantial population through intensive Kumara cultivation during the 14th and 15th centuries. This wasn't primitive farming, this was agricultural engineering that rivaled anything happening in Europe at the same time. Taro cultivation persisted in the warmer northern regions, with communities developing specialized techniques for growing this traditional Polynesian staple in New Zealand conditions. Archaeological evidence from Northland sites shows the construction of elaborate irrigation systems that diverted stream water to create the flooded growing conditions required for taro cultivation. These irrigation works, featuring stone-lined channels and wooden gates for water control, demonstrate the sophisticated engineering capabilities that Maori communities developed to maintain traditional agricultural practices in their new environment. The commitment to preserving these cultural traditions, despite the enormous labor required, reveals the deep spiritual and social significance of traditional crops. The hunting of moa and other native birds provided crucial protein sources that supported larger populations than had been possible in Polynesia, but also required the development of entirely new hunting technologies and strategies. Archaeological evidence from Emoa hunting sites reveals the use of sophisticated trapping systems, drive lanes, and specialized tools that enabled the systematic harvesting of these massive birds. The Shag River mouth site contains evidence of large-scale seal hunting operations as well, with specialized tools for skinning and blubber extraction, along with elaborate drying racks for preserving meat and hides. The seasonal nature of seal hunting required sophisticated planning and coordination, with communities organizing expeditions that could involve dozens of participants travelling hundreds of kilometres to reach productive hunting grounds during optimal periods. Marine resources provided the foundation for coastal economies, with communities developing increasingly specialised fishing technologies adapted to New Zealand conditions. The construction of elaborate stone fish traps in tidal areas represents a significant innovation that enabled the capture of large quantities of fish with minimal labour input. Archaeological investigations of these structures reveal sophisticated understanding of tidal patterns, fish behaviour, and stone construction techniques that created highly effective fishing installations. The Māori fishhook industry also underwent significant development during this period, with craftspeople learning to work with local materials including bone from marine mammals and shells from New Zealand species to create hooks adapted for local fish species. The concept of rahui emerged as a crucial mechanism for sustainable resource management, allowing communities to temporarily restrict access to specific areas or resources to prevent overexploitation. Archaeological evidence suggests that rahui restrictions were widely employed to protect breeding populations of seals and seabirds, seasonal fishing grounds during spawning periods, and forest areas where particular tree species were being harvested for construction purposes. The effectiveness of these traditional conservation measures is demonstrated by the long-term sustainability of many resource bases, with some coastal fishing grounds and forest areas supporting continuous exploitation for centuries without apparent depletion, a remarkable achievement in sustainable resource management. The development of PA, or fortified settlements, represents one of the most distinctive innovations of classical Māori society, reflecting both the military engineering capabilities of Māori communities and the increasing territorial competition that characterized this period. The earliest PA date to the 14th century and show clear evolution from simple defensive positions to elaborate fortress complexes that could house entire communities during times of conflict. The Aotearoa Pa in Auckland, constructed on a narrow isthmus between two harbours, demonstrates the strategic principles that governed PA site selection, with natural defensive features augmented by sophisticated earthworks including terraced fighting platforms, protected water sources, and multiple defensive lines. But here's where things get really interesting. These fortifications would soon face challenges from an entirely unexpected direction. On December 13, 1642, Dutch explorer Abel Tasman's two ships, the Heemskerk and Zeehan, approached the northwestern coast of Te Waipunamu in what Europeans would later name Golden Bay. Tasman's expedition, dispatched by the Dutch East India Company to investigate reports of a great southern land that might contain valuable resources or provide new trade routes, represented the first documented European contact with New Zealand and its indigenous inhabitants. The encounter that followed would establish patterns of misunderstanding and conflict that would influence European perceptions of Maori society for generations. Tasman's ships had been at sea for months, having departed Batavia in August 1642, and the crew members possessed no knowledge of Maori culture, social organisation, or protocols for peaceful contact. The Maori communities of the region, likely belonging to Te Aotearoa iwi, had been observing the strange vessels since their appearance on the horizon. These massive wooden structures, unlike anything in their experience, presented both an unprecedented threat and a source of intense curiosity. Traditional protocols for dealing with unknown visitors required careful assessment of their intentions and capabilities before any direct contact could be attempted. The presence of armed men visible on the ship's decks, combined with the vessel's imposing size and unfamiliar construction, suggested that these strangers possessed significant military capabilities that demanded cautious evaluation. On the morning of December 19th, several Maori waka approached Tasman's ships, with the occupants calling out in their own language while displaying traditional weapons, including taiaha and mia. The Dutch sailors, unable to understand the Maori communications and interpreting the display of weapons as hostile intent, prepared their own firearms and maintained defensive positions aboard their vessels. Tasman ordered his men to play trumpets and display Dutch flags, hoping to demonstrate peaceful intentions. But these European gestures carried no meaning within Maori cultural frameworks and may have been interpreted as challenges or threats. The fatal misunderstanding occurred when a small Dutch boat carrying several sailors attempted to travel between the two ships. A Maori waka intercepted the boat, and in the ensuing confrontation, 4 Dutch sailors were killed and others wounded. The Maori warriors, following traditional combat practices, withdrew after achieving tactical success, but their actions confirmed European fears about the hostile nature of New Zealand's inhabitants. Tasman immediately ordered his ships to depart the area, naming the location Murderers Bay and recording in his journal that the inhabitants were rough, wild people who could not be trusted for peaceful trade or settlement. This violent first encounter established a pattern of European preconceptions about Maori society that would persist for decades. Tasman's official reports describe New Zealand as inhabited by savage cannibals who attacked without provocation, creating an image that discouraged further Dutch exploration and influenced subsequent European expeditions. For over a century, New Zealand remained largely unknown to European navigators, existing only as a dangerous coastline to be avoided rather than explored. The resumption of European contact began with Captain James Cook's first Pacific voyage aboard HMS Endeavour, which reached New Zealand waters in October 1769. Cook's expedition, sponsored by the Royal Society ostensibly for astronomical observations but secretly instructed to search for the hypothetical southern continent, carried a crew of 94 men including scientists, artists, and the Tahitian navigator Tupaia, whose knowledge of Polynesian languages and customs would prove crucial for establishing communication with Maori communities. Unlike Tasman's brief and hostile encounter, Cook's 3 voyages to New Zealand between 1769 and 1777 involved extensive coastal mapping, numerous landing attempts, and sustained interactions with Maori groups across both islands. Cook's first landing attempt at Poverty Bay on October 8, 1769 initially seemed destined to repeat Tasman's violent experience. Local Maori, likely from Te Aitanga a Mahaki, approached the British landing party with traditional challenges, performing haka and displaying weapons in accordance with established protocols for confronting unknown visitors. The British sailors, armed with muskets and unfamiliar with Maori customs, interpreted these displays as immediate threats to their safety. When a group of Maori warriors advanced toward the landing party, Cook's men fired their weapons, killing several Maori and wounding others before retreating to their ship. But then something remarkable happened that would change everything. Tupaia stepped forward and began speaking in his native Tahitian language. The presence of Tupaia aboard the Endeavour proved transformative for subsequent encounters. As a Polynesian navigator and priest from Raiatea, Tupaia could communicate with Maori using related Polynesian languages, bridging the linguistic gap that had prevented meaningful dialogue during earlier contacts. Through Tupaia's translations, Cook's expedition learned that the inhabitants called their land Aotearoa and organized themselves into complex tribal structures with sophisticated concepts of territorial ownership and resource management. Tupaia's cultural knowledge enabled him to explain European intentions and negotiate protocols for peaceful interaction that respected Maori customs while advancing British exploration objectives. Finally, after 127 years, Europeans and Maori were actually talking to each other rather than just fighting. The mapping of New Zealand's coastline during Cook's voyages represented an unprecedented achievement in Pacific navigation and cartography. Over the course of his 3 expeditions, Cook's crews systematically charted over 2,400 kilometers of coastline, identifying major harbors, river mouths, and geographical features, while recording detailed observations of Maori settlements, agricultural practices, and social organization. The accuracy of Cook's charts, produced using sophisticated surveying instruments and astronomical observations, provided European navigators with reliable information about New Zealand waters for the first time since Tasman's brief encounter over a century earlier. Cook's interactions with Maori communities varied dramatically depending on local circumstances, tribal politics, and the specific protocols employed for establishing contact. At Queen Charlotte Sound, where Cook established a base camp during his second and third voyages, relationships with local Maori developed into sustained trading partnerships that provided fresh food, water, and repairs for the British ships in exchange for iron tools, nails, and other European manufactured goods. The Maori inhabitants of the Sound, primarily from Ngati Kuia and Rangitane Iwi, quickly recognized the superior cutting capabilities of iron implements compared to their traditional stone tools, and eagerly sought opportunities to acquire these valuable trade items. Think about what was happening here. Centuries of isolation were ending, and Maori society was about to be transformed in ways no one could possibly anticipate. The introduction of iron tools represented the first significant technological transfer from European to Maori society, with consequences that extended far beyond simple tool replacement. Iron axes could fell trees in a fraction of the time required by traditional stone implements, revolutionizing construction practices and enabling the rapid clearing of forest areas for agricultural expansion. Iron fish hooks proved more durable and effective than traditional bone hooks, increasing fishing productivity and allowing access to larger fish species that had been difficult to catch with traditional equipment. The superior cutting edges of iron knives and chisels enhanced wood carving capabilities, enabling Maori craftsmen to create more elaborate decorative work and construct larger, more sophisticated buildings. However, the limited availability of iron tools during these early contact periods created new sources of social tension within Maori communities. Traditional systems of resource allocation and gift exchange had no established protocols for distributing such valuable and scarce items, leading to conflicts between individuals and groups seeking to acquire European goods. Archaeological evidence from sites occupied during the early contact period shows concentrations of iron artifacts in high-status burials and residential areas, suggesting that access to European trade goods became incorporated into existing social hierarchies and may have enhanced the manner of individuals who could successfully negotiate with European visitors. Cook's detailed ethnographic observations, recorded in his journals and supplemented by accounts from other expedition members, including botanist Joseph Banks and artist Sidney Parkinson, provided Europeans with their first comprehensive descriptions of Maori society, technology, and cultural practices. These accounts documented sophisticated agricultural systems, elaborate artistic traditions, complex social hierarchies, and advanced military engineering capabilities that contradicted earlier European assumptions about the primitive nature of New Zealand's inhabitants. Cook's descriptions of Maori pa fortifications particularly impressed European readers, with detailed accounts of earthwork construction techniques and defensive strategies that demonstrated sophisticated military engineering knowledge. The trading relationships established during Cook's voyages introduced Maori communities to a range of European goods beyond iron tools, including cloth, beads, mirrors, and other manufactured items that gradually became incorporated into traditional exchange networks. Maori traders demonstrated sophisticated negotiating skills, quickly learning to assess the relative values of different European goods and demanding premium prices for essential supplies like fresh food and water that the British expeditions desperately needed. The development of standardized exchange rates between European and Maori goods created the foundation for more extensive trading relationships that would develop in subsequent decades. But these peaceful trading encounters were about to give way to something far more dangerous. The gradual integration of European goods into Maori society accelerated dramatically in the opening decades of the 19th century, as trading relationships evolved from occasional exchanges with visiting expeditions to sustained commercial networks linking New Zealand communities with Australian colonies and international markets. The arrival of sealers, whalers, and timber traders created permanent European presence in New Zealand waters, fundamentally altering the balance of power between Maori communities and introducing technologies that would transform traditional warfare beyond recognition. The most significant of these innovations was the musket, a weapon whose impact on Maori society would prove far more profound than any previous European introduction. The first muskets reached Maori hands through trading relationships established with sealing gangs operating from bases in Dusky Sound and other remote locations along the South Island coast. These rough men, primarily from Australian penal colonies, possessed few scruples about trading firearms for provisions, flax, and other local products they could sell in Sydney markets. Unlike the disciplined naval expeditions of Cook's era, the sealers operated with minimal government oversight and readily supplied weapons to any Maori willing to pay their prices. Archaeological evidence from sealing stations shows caches of muskets, powder, and shot stored alongside traditional trade goods, indicating that firearms quickly became standard items in the informal economy that developed around European resource extraction operations. The transformative potential of musket technology became apparent to Maori leaders who witnessed demonstrations of European firepower during trading encounters. A single musket ball could penetrate traditional wooden shields and inflict fatal wounds at ranges far exceeding those of traditional weapons like taiaha or mia. More significantly, muskets enabled relatively inexperienced warriors to kill seasoned fighters whose combat skills had been developed over decades of training with traditional weapons. The psychological impact of musket fire, with its thunderous noise and clouds of smoke, proved equally important in disrupting traditional battle formations and intimidating opponents unfamiliar with gunpowder weapons. Everything was about to change, and change fast. Hongi Hika, the influential Ngapuhi rangatira from the Bay of Islands, emerged as the most successful early adopter of musket technology and the strategic innovations it enabled. Through careful cultivation of relationships with European traders, missionaries, and government officials, Hongi accumulated substantial quantities of firearms and ammunition while developing tactical doctrines that maximized their effectiveness against traditionally armed opponents. His first major campaign in 1818 targeted the Thames region, where Ngati Maru settlements had prospered through traditional horticulture and trade with European vessels visiting the Firth of Thames. The attack on Ngati Maru demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of coordinated musket tactics against traditional Maori defensive systems. Hongi's warriors, armed with approximately 300 muskets acquired through years of trading and diplomatic missions, approached the fortified PA at Totara under cover of darkness and established firing positions that commanded the main defensive works. When dawn revealed their presence, the defenders found themselves trapped within earthworks that had been designed to protect against traditional weapons, but offered little shelter from musket balls that could penetrate wooden palisades and earthen banks. The systematic destruction of Ngati Maru resistance over several days of siege warfare established new paradigms for Maori military operations and demonstrated the obsolescence of traditional fortification systems when confronted with firearms. And this was just the beginning. The musket wars had begun. The success of Hongi's Thames campaign triggered a rapid escalation in musket acquisition efforts across Maori society as tribal leaders recognized that survival depended on obtaining firearms before their enemies could gain decisive advantages. Communities that had previously invested their surplus production in traditional prestige goods like carved weapons, feather cloaks, and jade ornaments redirected their economic activities toward acquiring the pigs, flax, potatoes, and preserved foods that European traders demanded in exchange for muskets. This fundamental shift in economic priorities disrupted traditional patterns of resource allocation and social display, while creating new forms of wealth and status based on access to European trade networks. Ngati Toa chief Te Rauparaha emerged as another master of musket warfare, employing firearms to extend his influence far beyond the traditional boundaries of his tribal territory. Based initially at Kauai on the west coast of the North Island, Te Rauparaha recognized that his relatively small tribal group could only survive the escalating conflicts by adopting innovative strategies that leveraged European technology and disrupted traditional patterns of tribal warfare. His decision to relocate his people to Kapiti Island in 1822 demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking, establishing a base that was easily defensible against traditional attacks, while providing excellent access to European shipping and trade opportunities. From his Kapiti stronghold, Te Rauparaha launched a series of campaigns that extended Ngati Toa influence across Cook Strait and into the northern regions of the South Island. His 1828 attack on the Ngai Tahu settlement at Kaiapoi employed combined land and sea operations that overwhelmed traditional defensive preparations through superior firepower and tactical mobility. The destruction of Kaiapoi, one of the largest and most prosperous Maori settlements in the South Island, demonstrated how musket-armed forces could project power across vast distances and devastate communities that had previously felt secure behind their traditional fortifications. Think about the horror: an entire civilization's military technology rendered obsolete within a single generation, leaving communities desperately scrambling to acquire the new weapons or face annihilation. The demographic impact of the musket wars proved catastrophic for many Maori communities, with some regions experiencing population declines of 50% or more during the most intensive periods of conflict. Taranaki, caught between the expanding influence of Ngati Toa from the south and Waikato forces from the north, suffered particularly severe losses as repeated campaigns devastated agricultural systems and forced survivors to abandon their traditional territories. Archaeological investigations of abandoned settlements from this period reveal evidence of hasty evacuation, with valuable items left behind and storage pits filled in to prevent their use by enemies. Entire regions were depopulated, their inhabitants either killed, enslaved, or scattered as refugees. The displacement of populations during the musket wars created refugee communities that struggled to maintain traditional cultural practices while adapting to unfamiliar environments and reduced resources. Ngati Mutunga and Ngati Tama Iwi, driven from their Taranaki homelands by Te Rauparaha's campaigns, eventually relocated to the Chatham Islands, where they encountered the indigenous Moriori population. The complex interactions that developed between these displaced Maori communities and the Moriori demonstrated how the social disruptions caused by musket warfare extended far beyond the immediate theatres of conflict to affect previously isolated populations throughout the New Zealand region. The arrival of Christian missionaries in the early 19th century introduced another transformative element into Maori society that interacted in complex ways with the ongoing military conflicts and social changes. The first permanent mission station, established by Samuel Marsden at Rangihoa in the Bay of Islands in 1814, represented the beginning of sustained European efforts to convert Maori to Christianity, while introducing European concepts of literacy, agriculture, and social organization. The missionaries, primarily from the Church Missionary Society, brought with them not only religious teachings but also new technologies, educational methods, and cultural practices that would profoundly influence Maori society. But here's the contradiction that would define this era. Missionaries preached peace while traders sold weapons of war. The introduction of literacy through missionary education programs proved to have revolutionary consequences for Maori society that extended far beyond simple religious instruction. The ability to read and write enabled Maori individuals to communicate across vast distances, preserve traditional knowledge in permanent form, and engage directly with European legal and commercial systems without relying on interpreters. The development of written Maori using European alphabetic systems created new possibilities for cultural preservation and political organization that would prove crucial during subsequent decades of increasing European settlement and government control. Suddenly, a purely oral culture had access to the power of the written word. The devastating social transformations wrought by 3 decades of musket wars had fundamentally altered the balance of power within Maori society by 1840, creating conditions that made many rangatira receptive to proposals for establishing formal governmental authority that might restore stability and order to their disrupted communities. The British government, increasingly concerned about reports of lawlessness in New Zealand waters and the growing influence of French Catholic missions in the Pacific, recognized that the informal arrangements that had governed European Maori relations since Cook's voyages were inadequate for managing the expanding colonial presence. British anxiety about French territorial ambitions in the Pacific had been mounting throughout the 1830s as reports reached London of French naval expeditions, Catholic missionary activities, and commercial ventures that suggested coordinated efforts to establish French influence in New Zealand. The arrival of French warships at the Bay of Islands in 1837 and subsequent visits by French officials who conducted formal meetings with Maori rangatira convinced British colonial administrators that immediate action was necessary to prevent French annexation of territories that British subjects had been developing for decades. The race was on. Whoever established governmental authority first would control New Zealand's future. The appointment of Captain William Hobson as Lieutenant Governor of New Zealand in 1839 represented the British government's commitment to establishing formal colonial administration that could address mounting problems through the creation of recognized legal and political institutions. Hobson, a naval officer with extensive experience in colonial administration, received instructions to negotiate a treaty with Maori chiefs that would establish British sovereignty while protecting Maori rights and property interests. The Colonial Office recognized that any successful arrangement would require Maori consent and cooperation, making diplomatic skill and cultural sensitivity essential components of Hobson's mission. The drafting of the treaty document involved intensive consultations between Hobson and his advisors, but the compressed time frame for treaty preparation left insufficient opportunity for careful consideration of how complex legal concepts would be translated into Maori language and understood by indigenous signatories. The crucial role of missionary Henry Williams in translating the treaty from English to Maori introduced interpretive challenges that would have profound consequences for subsequent constitutional development. Williams, despite his years of residence in New Zealand and extensive knowledge of Maori language, faced the impossible task of finding Maori equivalents for European legal and political concepts that had no direct parallels in traditional Maori society. The most significant translation challenge involved the concept of sovereignty, which the English version described as all the rights and powers of sovereignty that Maori chiefs would cede to Queen Victoria. Williams chose to translate this phrase using the term kawanatanga, derived from the English word governor, which conveyed the concept of governmental administration but lacked the comprehensive implications of absolute sovereign authority that characterized European constitutional theory. This translation suggested to Maori readers that they were agreeing to the establishment of a governmental structure similar to those they had observed in missionary stations or trading posts, rather than surrendering their fundamental rights of self-governance. Here's where things get really complicated. What Maori thought they were signing and what the British thought they were getting were two completely different things. The parallel promise in Article 2 that Maori would retain Tino Rangatiratanga over their lands, villages, and treasured possessions created additional interpretive complications that would generate decades of constitutional controversy. The term Tino Rangatiratanga, which Williams used to translate the English phrase full, exclusive, and undisturbed possession, carried connotations of chiefly authority and autonomous governance that appeared to contradict the sovereignty cession described in Article 1. Maori understanding of Tino Rangatiratanga encompassed not merely property ownership, but the full range of political, spiritual, and social authority that traditional rangatira exercised over their communities and territories. The treaty signing ceremony at Waitangi on February 6, 1840, brought together an unprecedented gathering of Maori rangatira from throughout the northern regions of New Zealand, representing diverse iwi and hapu whose relationships had been shaped by decades of alliance, conflict, and competition during the Musket Wars. The debates that preceded the treaty signing revealed the sophisticated political understanding that many Maori rangatira had developed through their interactions with European traders, missionaries, and government officials. Tamati Wakanene of Ngati Hau argued forcefully for accepting British governance as a means of ending the violence and instability that had plagued Maori communities during the Musket Wars, contending that formal governmental authority could provide the security necessary for economic development and cultural preservation. Opposition voices led by rangatira like Rewa of Ngati Rahiri expressed concerns about surrendering traditional authority to foreign rulers whose understanding of Maori customs and values remained limited despite years of contact. These critics argued that British governance would inevitably favour European interests over Maori rights, pointing to examples from other British colonies where indigenous populations had suffered displacement and cultural destruction following the establishment of colonial administration. The complexity of these debates demonstrated the high level of political sophistication that Maori leaders had developed, but in the end, approximately 40 rangatira signed the treaty on February 6th, each with their own understanding of what they were agreeing to. The establishment of colonial government institutions following the treaty signing created immediate tensions between British administrative practices and Maori expectations about how the new governmental arrangements would function. Hobson's proclamation of British sovereignty over New Zealand on May 21, 1840 asserted comprehensive governmental authority that extended far beyond the limited administrative functions that many Maori had expected when they agreed to accept Kawanatanga. The appointment of European magistrates, the establishment of European legal procedures, and the creation of colonial legislative institutions demonstrated that British governance would involve fundamental changes to existing social and political arrangements rather than the cooperative partnership that some Maori leaders had anticipated. The colonial government's approach to land policy created particularly severe tensions as British officials implemented procedures for validating European land purchases that often conflicted with Maori understanding of traditional property rights and treaty guarantees. The establishment of land claims commissions to investigate pre-treaty land transactions revealed the extent of confusion and conflict surrounding European settlement patterns, with many purchases involving disputed titles, inadequate compensation, or fraudulent documentation. The Commissioner's decisions, based on European legal principles rather than Maori customary law, frequently favoured European claimants over Maori vendors who had received inadequate payment or had not understood the permanent nature of the transactions they had agreed to. The rapid growth of European immigration following the treaty signing created demographic pressures that strained the accommodation between colonial government and Maori communities. The New Zealand Company's systematic colonisation schemes brought thousands of European settlers to Wellington, Nelson, and other planned settlements, creating substantial European populations that demanded governmental services, legal protection, and access to land for agricultural development. These immigrant communities often possessed limited understanding of or sympathy for Maori rights and customs, viewing indigenous land tenure systems as obstacles to efficient agricultural development rather than legitimate property arrangements deserving legal protection. The stage was set for conflict, and it wouldn't be long in coming. The Northern War of 1845–46 fought primarily in the Bay of Islands region, where the treaty had been signed just 5 years earlier, represented the first major military challenge to British authority in New Zealand and exposed the limitations of colonial government capabilities. The conflict began with disputes over customs duties and governmental authority, but escalated into sustained warfare that required substantial British military reinforcements to resolve. The sophisticated defensive strategies employed by Maori forces, particularly the innovative PA fortifications designed by Kawiti and other military leaders, demonstrated that traditional Maori military capabilities had evolved to effectively counter European tactical advantages. The siege of Aotearoa Pa in June 1845 demonstrated the revolutionary defensive innovations that Maori military engineers had developed in response to European firepower and tactical methods. Unlike traditional PA that relied on high earthen walls and wooden palisades for protection, Aotearoa featured low-profile earthworks that presented minimal targets for artillery bombardment, while incorporating sophisticated systems of trenches, tunnels, and firing positions that enabled defenders to concentrate their fire against attacking forces. The PA's design included multiple defensive lines that forced attackers to overcome successive obstacles while exposing them to crossfire from concealed positions, creating killing zones where European tactical formations became liabilities rather than advantages. The British assault on Aotearoa on July 1, 1845, resulted in a devastating defeat that shattered European assumptions about their military superiority over indigenous forces. The attack, led by Lieutenant Colonel Henry Despard, with approximately 400 troops including regular infantry, artillery, and naval personnel, followed conventional European siege tactics that had proven effective against traditional fortifications, but were entirely unsuited for the innovative defensive systems that Kawiti had constructed. The British forces advanced in close formation across open ground toward what appeared to be lightly defended earthworks, only to encounter concentrated musket fire from concealed positions that inflicted heavy casualties while remaining largely immune to return fire. Think about the shock, the mighty British Empire defeated by what they had dismissed as primitive savages. The emergence of the Kungitanga, or Maori King movement, during the 1850s represented a sophisticated political response to the challenges posed by colonial expansion and the erosion of traditional Maori autonomy. The movement's origins lay in discussions among Waikato and Ngati Maniapoto leaders about the need for unified Maori political organization that could effectively resist European encroachment while preserving traditional cultural values and social structures. The selection of Te Werowero as the first Maori king in 1858 created an alternative source of political authority that directly challenged the colonial government's claims to comprehensive sovereignty over New Zealand. Finally, Maori were organizing on a scale that could match European political power. The Taranaki conflict that erupted in March 1860 originated in land disputes at Waitara, where the colonial government attempted to purchase territory from Tera, a minor chief whose authority to sell was disputed by other members of his iwiai, including the paramount chief Wiremu Kingi. The government's determination to complete the purchase, despite Maori opposition, reflected broader colonial policies that prioritized European settlement expansion over treaty obligations or Maori property rights. The decision to use military force to occupy disputed land transformed a local property dispute into the opening engagement of a broader war that would eventually encompass much of the North Island. The Waikato War began in July 1863 with British forces crossing the Mangatawiri River, the boundary the Kangitanga leaders had established to mark their territory and assert their political autonomy. The invasion force, comprising approximately 12,000 regular troops supported by colonial militia and artillery units, represented the largest military commitment that Britain had made to any colonial conflict in the Pacific region. The scale of this military deployment demonstrated British recognition that the destruction of Maori political independence would require overwhelming force applied systematically over an extended period. The battles that followed would be brutal, desperate, and ultimately decisive in determining New Zealand's future. The consequences of the New Zealand Wars extended far beyond the immediate military casualties and destruction to encompass fundamental changes in land ownership, political authority, and social organization that would shape the country's development for generations. The colonial government's policy of land confiscation, implemented through the New Zealand Settlements Act 1863, resulted in the seizure of approximately 1.6 million hectares of Maori land in the Waikato, Taranaki, Bay of Plenty, and East Coast regions. These confiscations, justified as punishment for rebellion against lawful authority, represented the largest single transfer of land from Maori to European ownership in New Zealand's history, entire tribal territories simply taken by governmental decree. The establishment of the Native Land Court in 1865 created legal mechanisms for converting traditional Maori land tenure systems into individual property ownership that could be readily transferred to European purchasers. The court's procedures required Maori communities to prove their traditional ownership rights according to European legal standards, while fragmenting collective tribal ownership into individual titles that could be sold separately. This transformation of land tenure systems undermined traditional social structures while creating opportunities for European speculators to acquire Maori land through debt, legal manipulation, and other predatory practices that would continue for decades. The long-term demographic consequences of the New Zealand Wars and subsequent land policies created lasting patterns of Maori disadvantage that would persist well into the 20th century. A combination of military casualties, disease outbreaks, and forced displacement reduced Maori population levels while concentrating survivors in marginal areas with limited economic opportunities. The loss of traditional resource bases forced many Maori communities to abandon customary subsistence practices in favor of wage labor or marginal farming operations that provided inadequate incomes for maintaining traditional social structures and cultural practices. By 1900, the Maori population had declined to approximately 42,000, down from an estimated 100,000–200,000 at first European contact. The question was, could Maori culture even survive? The cultural preservation activities that emerged during the late 19th and early 20th centuries played crucial roles in maintaining Maori identity during periods when assimilation pressures were particularly intense. Leaders like Apirana Ngata combined traditional chiefly authority with advanced European education to become effective advocates for indigenous rights and cultural preservation. His graduation from Canterbury College with degrees in law and arts demonstrated Maori intellectual capabilities while providing him with the credentials necessary for effective participation in European professional and political circles. Ngata's political philosophy emphasized the importance of maintaining Maori cultural identity while adapting to the economic and social realities of the modern world. His famous advice to grasp the tools of the Pakeha to ensure Maori survival reflected sophisticated understanding that indigenous communities needed European knowledge and skills to protect their interests. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 created new opportunities for Maori political leaders to demonstrate their community's loyalty to the British Empire while advancing arguments for improved treatment and expanded rights. The formation of the Maori Pioneer Battalion, and later the Maori Battalion, demonstrated organized Maori commitment to the war effort while maintaining distinct indigenous identity and military traditions. Despite their distinguished service in France and other theatres, Maori veterans returned to find that their military contributions had not significantly improved their social status or political rights. The continued restrictions on Maori political participation, the ongoing loss of indigenous lands, and the persistent discrimination in employment and social services demonstrated that military service alone was insufficient to achieve equality. The influenza pandemic of 1918-1919 had devastating effects on Maori communities that were already struggling with the social and economic consequences of land loss, cultural disruption, and political marginalization. The disease spread rapidly through Maori settlements where overcrowded housing conditions, limited access to medical care, and weakened immune systems created ideal conditions for epidemic transmission. The death rate among Maori populations was significantly higher than among Europeans, reflecting both biological vulnerability to introduced diseases and inadequate health services in Maori areas. The pandemic's long-term consequences included the deaths of many elderly people who possessed irreplaceable knowledge of customary law, genealogy, and cultural practices, creating gaps in cultural transmission that could not be easily filled. The cultural renaissance that accelerated during the 1970s encompassed multiple aspects of Maori identity, including language, arts, spirituality, and social organization. The establishment of Kohanga Reo represented a particularly significant innovation that addressed language revitalization needs while creating new institutions for cultural transmission. These early childhood education programs combined traditional Maori child-rearing practices with contemporary educational methods while providing practical alternatives to English-only education that had contributed to language decline. The success of treaty settlements in providing economic capital and political recognition created new possibilities for Maori development, while the revitalization of Te Reo Māori and traditional cultural practices ensured the transmission of indigenous knowledge to future generations. The future prospects for Maori society appeared increasingly positive as the 21st century progressed, with strong iwi economies, revitalized cultural institutions, and growing political influence creating foundations for continued advancement and prosperity. The integration of traditional values with contemporary opportunities had enabled Maori communities to maintain their distinctive identity while participating fully in New Zealand's economic and social development. Maori television, established in 2004, provided dedicated platforms for Te Reo Māori programming while creating employment opportunities for indigenous broadcasters and performers, demonstrating the vitality and relevance of Maori language for modern communication needs. The story of Maori society from its Polynesian origins through contemporary revitalization represents one of the most remarkable examples of indigenous resilience and adaptation in the modern world. Despite experiencing devastating impacts from colonization, disease, and cultural suppression, Maori communities successfully preserved essential elements of their identity while developing innovative strategies for thriving in contemporary environments. The achievements of recent decades in securing treaty settlements, revitalizing Te Reo Māori, and building sustainable economic foundations demonstrated that indigenous peoples could overcome historical disadvantages through determined collective action, strategic leadership, and creative adaptation of traditional values to modern circumstances. As New Zealand moves forward into an increasingly globalized future, the strength and vitality of Maori culture provides both a unique national identity and valuable perspectives on sustainable development that benefit all New Zealanders. If you enjoyed this journey through one of the world's most remarkable indigenous civilizations, subscribe to Flow of History for more deep dives into humanity's most fascinating stories.